Hello, and welcome to this month's watercolor painting tutorial. This month we're going to paint this cute little picture of a girl flying a kite. There's some fiddly details, some bright lines. You're going to need to learn how to paint a person, and then you have this nice richly colored background that we can put down with some splashing techniques that I think you're really going to enjoy. So in order to have a lot of fun with that background, you need to first take care that your foreground figure is protected. So the first step is going to be to draw her. I've done most of that already. You can see that I've used an exterior grid that correlates the reference material to my drawing or my watercolor paper, and then that helps me to lay out the shapes of the girl pretty accurately. I'm just going to do a little bit final details here. You don't have to get every toenail right in this stage. You just need to protect the large shape of the girl, the whole girl, and the whole kite. So I'm darkening those lines as well. Okay, frisket film. Notice that I'm moving it to the end so that I can save as much film as possible. I'm just going to outline those shapes onto the frisket film. There's the girl, then I'll move it over and outline that kite as well. Again, I'm not going to worry if I get it precisely right. I just need to have it close enough that after I cut it out and I lay it down, I can go over the outside lines with masking fluid. So I'm just going to cut out my kite here really quickly. And then I'm going to line it up against my drawing before I take the tape off, just to see how well I did. Then this can be the trickiest part, is actually getting that sticker off. Ah, excellent. I'm going to pull it out about that much and then just trim off the back, because I've learned over the years that this is the easiest way. Then this part still has backing on it, so I can line it up, press down the sticker part, and then lift it and zip. It should fall right into place for you. So then, after you've done that, you can use a fine line masking fluid pen like this, and I'm going to draw that bar that goes through the wings of the kite across the top like that. And then there's some other little details like this ribbon that comes up, and that is all there is to it. Then you just have to leave it to dry. Only takes a few minutes. I'm going to do the same thing to the little girl, but I'll do that off camera. I'll come back to you when that frisket film is dry and we're ready to paint. Okay, everything's laid out, protected, dried. We're ready to start in that background. It's a really simple background. It's just a few shades of green, and it's really blotchy, so it's going to be perfect for a sponge technique. So what I'm going to do is just spritz the top of my paper, and then I'm going to mix up a puddle of that green. Then I have a sponge here. I'm going to get it wet and then squeeze out all of that water and just get some green on my sponge and sponge it all over. Now I like the texture that the sponge gives me, but it can really look dry. And if you get the sponge too wet, it's not good, and if you get it too dry, it's not good. So you just have to experiment with putting some sponge texture down, and then some of it you're going to brush on, some of it you're going to sponge on, some of it you'll let it just drop down on like this and puddle up. So you're going to have a variety of textural looks. Also, don't be afraid to mix in some completely different colors. So in some of these areas I'm going to have a lot more yellow, and then some places I'm going to have almost pure blue. And they're just going to mix together right there on the page, and sometimes I'll help them to mix by sponging. Sometimes I'll help them to mix by spraying with some water. Okay, so just play. Drop stuff on there, fiddle around, move it, let gravity do some of the mixing for you as well. Going to give it a spritz. Salt can work well in a pattern like this too, or else just droplets of water. They make their own interesting texture. Another thing you can do is protect the bottom, and then over the top, or you're going to splatter. So just get your paintbrush full of some juicy color here, knock it down. It's going to work especially well when the background is wet, and having a lot of paint on your paper is going to really be beneficial too, because the watercolor is going to tend to dry and lighten. If you don't have plenty of color on there, oh, that's so cool. If you don't have plenty of color on there, it's going to dry, it's going to get really blasé. You don't want blasé, you want excitement. So do stuff like this, spatter it, and then twirl it, twist it, let it drip, move it around. Use your finger if you want. Okay, I don't want these white specks. I feel like I need just a little bit more blue. Now I'd get a completely different texture if I splattered with a round brush. So everything changes, but I think that this looks interesting now, and I'm pleased with the results. So we're going to set it aside. We're going to let it dry completely. That green is all dried now, so let's remove the pieces of masking fluid, just the ones that went into the green, because I need to combine them with the lower piece of the landscape here. That's yellows. That's what we're going to do next. So I'm going to work really similarly, except I want there to be a slight indication of where she's standing. So the grass here is a little bit longer, and then it's shorter here. So here we go. Keep my reference material close. We're going to work with yellows this time. So if you need to, you can clean off a space of your palette so you have plenty of room for those nice, clean, bright yellows. And there's almost some pinks and oranges mixed in there too. So mix up a color, test it with a test strip to make sure you have the right idea. Those look like they'll work very well. And then I'm going to just, well, I don't want to get this all over my reference material. Move the reference material out of the way to safety. Protect the portion of the painting that you've already done. And then you're just going to splatter. And you should get a nice blend of some lines and some spatters. So when you experiment with this in your own studio, you'll find that holding the brush at different angles and whacking it different ways is going to produce different techniques. So really you just kind of want a variety of everything, and I'm getting in some different colors, some kind of cool pinky stuff, just spattering away, nice and loose, fun. Got that top part protected so you can just go nuts. So the first step is to get the color on the page like this. There's plenty of color. If you want to add some pure yellow, just make sure that you rinse the brush out first so it doesn't get too muddy. So yeah, you've got this cool stuff going on. Maybe just a little more down here. Okay, good. Then I'm going to take these things off. Focus in a little bit on what we're doing. And then with that round brush, I'm going to make a few strokes that look more deliberate. So this is where I'm going to start coloring in the pieces that I protected with masking fluid from the first round. And I'm going to make those the same color as these spattered marks, but since they're more deliberate shapes, it's going to help the whole thing to look more deliberate and professional. So let me just do some of these. Drag through some stems. So let me do some of this work and come back to you. All right, this is dry, so we're going to remove our masking fluid and Frisket foam just from the Kite. Ugh. Looks like we got some paint slip underneath. No problem. I'll teach you a few ways that you can deal with this. So because I really prefer the way the color looks on watercolor paper as opposed to just white paint, the first way that I like to try to fix it is to get an angled shader craft brush, which is a little bit more rough. Get it damp and then just rub that paint out, blot it dry, rub again. And you can see I'm not going to get back to my clean, pristine paper, but it does take quite a bit of that color out. Enough that depending on the color that you're wanting to paint over the top, you can get away with it. I might need to change some of the shades of the Kite because that green got pretty dark and the Kite is supposed to be bright yellow in some places. We'll just have to see how it goes. If it can't work, you can also use with the white paint, or you can use paint that has been mixed with white. So you essentially transform any of your colors into opaque colors that will lay over the top. And it looks chalky, but for small areas it's okay. So we'll just have to see what we think looks best. There are also products like Pro White. Daler Rowney puts that out, and that is a product that is like white paint, only I like it quite a bit better than white paint, which I don't even own, because it looks like the white paint got under there too, but I'll deal with her hand when I take that off later. Anyway, it doesn't act quite the same as paint. I like it better, but you can experiment yourself. So in the meantime, let's do a little bit more work down here. I'm going to get a rigger brush, that's this thin one with the long bristles, and I'm going to start developing just a few more of those grass stems in the foreground. So I'm going to go in with an intense green and just add some of these grassy shapes. And there are some cool darks in this fern. So I'm not going for this exact fern that I see on the picture. I'm just sort of using the reference as some suggestions of what the fern might look like. Right, because I don't want to go crazy trying to reproduce the exact fern when this isn't a fern picture anyway. It's about a kite flying. So it doesn't really matter how exact the fern is. No, it doesn't. But let's just put in enough detail that it looks at least interesting. Maybe it's not going to look exactly like a fern. That's fine. It's going to look like a cool green leafy plant. And you can't go wrong if your painting is at least interesting. Better that it should be interesting than anything else. Better interesting than accurate, that's for sure. So put some of these swooshy lines in here, kind of play with some tone, playing around. That looks cool. Now I can't just have that one blat of this really dark green. I need to have it some other places too, or it's going to look like a colossal mistake. That's no good. So I'll have to go find some other dark places to highlight with some grass stems. That's a little bit intense. So I'm going to blot it out, at least lighten it. And there's a few more over here on the side. Remember, you just have to have the impression of some long grasses, and then the eye will see the rest of these grassy forms as more grass. You know why this is looking as interesting as it is in this fern? It's not because I did an accurate job of the leaves, it's because I had some interesting looking patterns and I wasn't afraid to really punch up the contrast. That is your secret as well. Punch up the contrasts, make your mistakes look intentional, and they are no longer mistakes. Ooh, See, if I make a little head on some of these grass blades, they look more like grass. And then there in a few places here and there, I am going to go in carefully and work around some of these grass shapes. Just a few places, and that will be enough to add realism to the whole thing. Okay, that's enough time on grass. For in the foreground here, I'm going to show you a different technique. So see how there's these blades of grass that stick up in front of a really dark shadow? I don't want to work around all those, but I do like the look of that. So I'm going to do a little cheat. You just use your masking fluid and that needle tool, and you protect the light blades of grass as you see them. Then when that dries, I can go over the top with that dark color, and voila, like magic, it looks exactly right. Just make sure that you don't have like these little balls at the end of every line in the masking fluid, or that won't look good. And then I'm just going to do that same thing, different places in the foreground as well. Scratch through some grass. And if the paint's dry, which here it's not, but over here it is, you can do some more of that in some of these places too. Grass is not hard to paint, but it is kind of hard to know when to stop. It's sort of hard to paint well. It's one of those challenging things, so the more practice you have, the better. So I'm going to let this grass dry, come back, add the layer over the top, take this off and start dealing with that little girl. And then we're going to be so close to done. It's exciting. So let's let that dry. Okay, so the masking fluid is dry, and now you can just get your big brush, fill it with a dark color, and stroke right over the top of that shadow. See? Voila. Amazing. And I like to get a nice dollop of the really intense dark and drop it right by the foot, because when that dries, it's going to disperse out nicely and look even more realistic. So let me just drag a bit of that color out. So as a shadow gets farther away from the source, it dissipates and looks lighter. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Then I'm going to look at my reference and going to use that to help determine where some of these other colors should be. So I've got some greens, and I'm going to just drop in some of these darker colors in the foreground where you're going to tend to see more contrast, and where I've laid down the masking fluid. So then I'm going to use some different brush techniques, sometimes even pushing the brush, which I know feels really weird, but then the bristles will sort of make a more interesting texture. And I'm still paying attention to my reference, so I don't want to add too many lights, or I don't want to cover up all the light areas with too much intense dark. And remember, you're always going to have better results if you have more than one color mixing together. So just throw in 2 or 3 colors into any wet area and let the colors mix together on the page. It's going to add a lot of interest, make the watercolor look a lot more spontaneous and kind of full-bodied and just interesting. You have to go over the top with something, or those masked strands aren't going to pop forward at all. So sometimes I have some solid colors, sometimes I have some alternating dark grasses that I'm just brushing in with the edge of a flat. Make sure that all your grass doesn't go one way or the other. Grass needs to be irregular. Yeah, this is looking very interesting. So we can go ahead and let this dry. It should only take a few minutes. Come back, can peel off the masking fluid and move on. All right. When the masking fluid is dry, you can peel off everything. I'm just going to use a rubber cement eraser here and take all the masking fluid off the paper. And off the girl. So you can see we have the same problem here, but I'll fix it, no problem. And the grass. And then you can see how well these washes go right over the top. Those little skinny blades of grass just pop right forward and look awesome. Peel and zoom in so you can see that a little better. So that is a really effective method for doing grass, and you just need to do a variety of approaches in the grass so it doesn't look too stagnant. It definitely reads as grass though, with the loose stuff back here, and then this, it does read as short grasses up front where she's standing, and then sort of a field of longer grasses, which is exactly what we see on the picture, so it's very effective. Here I have a crumb of blue that was dry, and then when I rubbed over, it smeared. So let's just kind of wet that down and blot. See if we can tone that crazy blue smear down a bit. And then remember I said that for the top here, you can do some more of that work around the top of the weeds. I don't want it to look quite so blocky, so I can break it up. Just use a small paintbrush and break into the weeds a little bit here and there with some different shapes to make some more distinct edges. Just make sure that you use the same color that predominates the background so that it will look like these are standing up against the background. See how well that works? It's fiddly, but a little bit goes a long way. So I'm just going to do that around the top edge. And I'll do most of that work off camera so that you are not bored to tears. But that system, now here I'm just fiddling in the negative shapes. I'm fiddling with negative shapes. And it's very effective for making some strong, interesting weeds. And it really helps it not to look like a big block of uninteresting plants here. Looks a lot more interesting. Also, you can reshape any weeds that got too blobby and give them a little bit more definition. It's all the same method. But now let's go to this little girl bit. I'm going to start by adding a base tone to her pants. Doesn't really matter what color I use. I'll just kind of mix up a gray blue here, and I'm just sticking to what I see in the picture. So I'm going with the shapes of the folds and the shadow shape. The shadow shapes are really important because on her bent leg, this knee here is darker, and that helps it look like it's bending so that she's realistically walking. Then up here I'm just going to wash over with some really almost clean color, just almost pure water, but it will blend in what I've already done. And this is all there is to making a base tone for those pants. Very good. I'm going to do the same thing in the shirt. Just wearing kind of a blasé purpley shirt color. I'm just going to paint the color of the shadows. So the kite is casting a shadow over her entire sleeve. I'm going to see if I can rub some of that green off at the same time. Let's drop in some different shades into this shadow as well. It's not just one color, it's several colors. Light just colors, I mean, everything. The light carries every color in it. So your shadows are going to tend to go towards any number of different colors. You'll have bluish shadows, reddish shadows, greenish shadows. So all you really have to do is pick a color family and then just mix up variations of that family and everything will blend together really nicely. Once I have the strict shadow shapes down, I'm just going to use a clean brush and soften up the edges, just like I did for the pants. So I still have a shadow shape, but no really harsh shadows on the shirt because it's really soft, diffused light. It's a very soft picture. Try to clean out some more of this green. The colors from the kite are also affecting the shadows here. So it's like the color is coming through the red on the kite and casting a kind of a red polar, or a red tone into things. So I'll include that. It's a shame about that tape not quite sticking to the surface as much as I would have liked. But the rubbing technique here is working pretty well. So just rub and blot, let it dry, and you are in good shape. But let's add that bit of red. I have it on, I put it down and then I sort of let it wash out. And that'll make more sense once we have the kite painted. So let's also paint a base tone over her face and hair, all in one fell swoop. And don't forget the fingers. Now that has to dry a little bit before we add any other shadows, but I can drop in a few more colors and let them just mix on the page. So here's a hint of some darker reds, and I'll just drop in some color on the cheeks so it'll diffuse out into the rest of the skin and just look a little bit more rosy. Same thing for the hair. That kite overhead is casting the red on the head too. Yeah, that's alizarin crimson. That looks a little bit more intentional. I like that. We don't want it to look like she's bleeding, but I like the way it looks vague and yet still very present. Wash this out. Now we'll let that dry and come back. Let's see, those pants are already pretty dry. Since the pants are pretty dry, let's go in now with a little darker blue and just tighten up some of these shadow colors. I'm just looking for the shapes of the shadows, referring to the reference really closely here. Nothing too tricky about it. If you're more comfortable, you can always draw these shadows in pencil and then just paint right over them. And remember, you don't have to paint everything that you see. And in fact, you're usually better off if you don't. So don't worry about all those fiddly details. Don't let them bog you down. You're trying to make a good painting that tells a definite story, and you don't need every detail from the photograph to tell the story. So here, these wrinkles, they're a little bit too wrinkly. I'm just going to wash over, soften them up, and join some of those shapes to make them simpler. I'm going to soften this. I'm going to soften this. Whenever possible, combine shapes. Make them larger and simpler. That goes for clothing, that goes for plants, that goes for faces, absolutely everything. Simpler is better. It's always better. All right, that's enough work on those pants. So you can do the same thing in the shirt and just add a touch more color to these shadows that we see here. Just enough to show the movement of the arm. right? So we don't need, again, every single shadow. Just have to look for those shadow shapes and put them down large and combined. That's good. In the face, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm looking for these large shapes. There's a shape that falls over the side of the face. I'm going to try to put that down as one big shape. Goes into the ear, and then it has this shadow under the chin and this tendon that shows that the neck is twisting. Then we're going to have just sort of vague indications, shadows around the eyes, nose, and mouth. Now this is actually pretty difficult to do. So if you're a beginner, don't worry about freehanding this with your brush, just draw the face. And I'm going to connect the shapes to go into the hair. And then after that is dried completely, we can add the really dark darks to the hair. For now, I'm just going to add a few back here where I know they aren't going to bleed into the face. Can go into the shoes here while the face is drying, and just add, she's wearing little pink sandals, so it's just kind of a simple pink stripe over the band and right there over the toe. We're going to let that color dry, then we can come back and add some more detail. So let it dry, come back. All right, this is dry, so let's finish up our painting here. I'm going to start with some color in the kite. So let's go with our yellow where it's going to show up best, right in here. Maybe over here, if we get lucky, huh? Just try to make it as dark as possible. Oh yeah, that's fine. Good. And there's another yellow stripe down here, as long as I've got it on the brush. We're hopefully getting away with it without using any of those opaque colors I don't really want to use. Rinse it out, and then I'll move to a magenta stripe, and then I'll probably have to move on to something else, because if the colors touch each other, of course they will bleed. Move to a smaller round to finish up those little corners. And then just make sure that you have the colors in the same place from side to side, just for consistency and realism. And there's a little bit of rainbow on this thing here, and this tail. But on the tail they seem to sort of bleed together more, so I'll let them bleed more on this tail too. Got a green, but this time I do use the tube green so it stands out more. There, that looks nice, festive. Can finish that kite in a little bit, but now let's go on to the little girl. Add the features of her face. I did draw them, just so I make sure I get them absolutely right. She's looking at her kite, so kind of keep in mind what she should be looking at. Then I'm just going to outline basic parts, the most important parts of the features, but not everything. Her face is really small, so it's easy to be overpowering with the detail. You're better off if you leave it a suggestion. So in the ears, don't do every line of the ears, just Do a little bit on the lower lobe, a little bit on the inside, and leave it at that. The viewer will see an ear without every single little detail. And actually, what you're going to find is that sometimes the detail will really work against you, and even though it will be correct, it won't look correct because you have too much or it's too dark. You know, it could be many things. So just start off with limited detail. You can always add more if you need it, but you can't take it away. Okay, then I'm going to add some darks in her hair, and the dark shapes will help to define the ears too. And just look at the reference carefully and put in dark shapes that help to define how the hair is moving. That's all you really need to do. Then here, this negative shape is going to define the neck, so put it in very carefully. And then you have a dark shadow under the chin. It's those dark shadows that really pull the whole thing together. So if you're careful with the placement of the darks, you are a winner with a successful watercolor. So if it ever becomes overwhelming, just remind yourself the only thing that has to be right is the darks. See how few details I've added, and already it's really coming through as a super realistic head. Why should it? Because the darks are right. Okay, I'm going to go to a slightly, well, let's see, let's finish up with her little fingers. I'm just going to add some red to the shadows of her fingers here, and some dark to separate the fingers that are holding the kite up here. Again, you don't have to explain every piece of it. Just give the viewer enough, they'll see a hand. Then I'm going to go really dark with the shadow in the sleeve, and immediately you see that hand come forth. I'm going to go and do something a little bit bold here. I want to have this large shape of a shadow that lies over the top of her face. I'm going to clarify it a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my larger round and just lay that shadow shape over the whole top of her head and face. Done. Doing things like that can be really scary because you're afraid you're going to ruin the whole thing. But you won't. And the thing is, you can only ever make a painting look as good as a certain level if you don't do things like that. So even if you are afraid, you need to start experimenting with large shadow shapes that lay over the top of everything so that you can push yourself to that next level. That was a big breakthrough point for me in my career as an artist. So just when you think you're done, see if a unifying shadow shape over the top of something wouldn't strengthen it. Usually it does. So go ahead and just take the leap. All right, now in her shirt, there are little pink flowers. I can add those in. Lickety split. Make sure that you put some down and then blot them so that they're lighter in the highlight areas. Just leave the dark ones alone, they're fine. And if you want to add more detail to the shirt with more patterns, if you want to add more detail to your shirt and add more intrinsic patterns, that's fine. Just keep in mind that you should only be able to see as much detail as you would expect at that level. So if this little girl is this small, her shirt's going to be even smaller. The patterns on her shirt are going to be very small. And how much detail would you be able to see if it's that small? Just, you can't see things as small as what you can paint them. So don't make that mistake. Let's add some more colors to our kite. Looks like we can do with a purple. Shaves along the very bottom. Purple is a good one because it will clean up that edge. And it's nice and dark. Then I can add that stick. There's this little visible kite stick. And she's holding the string in her hand somehow. I can't really understand how, looking at the picture, but it looks about like this. She has little blue socks on. You can add an indication of that. And then if you want to clean up, like the edge of her sleeve right here, go in with that background color, go nice and dark, and just clean up that negative shape. That'll also work for here beside her head, really anywhere that you want it just to be a little bit crisp. While I have some of that background color, I can do some more of the work in the weeds. La la la. And then just don't forget that you need to sort of rinse it out, pull it out so that it doesn't look so distractingly dark, like one weird dark line. You want it to blend in, so you just kind of wet your brush down and wiggle it around like this, and that'll blend it in. Here we've got that nice intense blue stripe. Alright, so let me just finish up the painting with these last few details. Just a dark here, a blob there. I'm going to finish up that work in the weeds, and I'll come back one last time and show you what we wound up with. Alright, I finished the kite, added a little bit more detail to the grass, probably nothing that you'll even notice. And now the only thing left to do is remove our tape. Just pull that off. All those dirty little speckles go with it, leaving us with a nice, clean border. That helps you know how it would look framed. So, this is a really fun little painting to work on. I hope that you download the reference and do it in your own studio. Don't forget that you can, if you mask out your figure, then you can have a lot of fun playing in the background with a lot of rich color and splashing effects, dripping, sponging, doing all kinds of things, flinging drops at it. And then just tighten up some details in the foreground. Make your girl nice and literal, and you have a really nicely balanced, colorful, eye-catching piece. So there's a lot that you can learn from painting this, even multiple times. I hope that you do so. I hope that you learned a lot from watching me do it. And most of all, I hope that you join me again next month for another painting tutorial. Thanks so much for watching.